And here we are with another episode of Inside Animation. Again, I am your host, Adam Sartain, and today we have with us the famous, amazing Mr. Mark Zickery,
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Glad to be
and
here, Adam.
the architect of our childhoods,
Yes, yes, it's my fault.
I would say. And for those listening, I've got a Smurfs background on.
Yes,
Uh, and
recognized it.
yes, I made sure to do that just for you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor.
For those who don't recognize that name, Mark has written for so many different animated shows, including the Smurfs, He-Man, and the real Ghostbusters. I'm sure you know this list
Yes, I do.
better than I do.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And He-Man and on and on. The Littles, Biscuits, Liberty's Kids, just you name it. You name it. I mean, there's a specific period when I was writing most of the shows on all the different networks and the animated shows. And so this was like late 70s throughout the 80s. It was a small group of us who were all in our 20s and early 30s at that point.
Now, I know you've written for a lot more than that, including Star Trek Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and so many other sci-fi shows. But today, this is a show about animation, so we're
Yeah.
going to talk about your writing for animation. So uh, now, obviously, uh, we know a writer writes, but I like to start off with going into exactly what your job is in the animation industry. So
Yeah.
how does what's the writing process like for an animated show?
Well, here's how it worked back then. It's very different now. Back then, you would come up with it, like for instance, with Smurfs, let's say. In that case, the American audience had not heard of Smurfs. They were very popular characters in Europe. They were called Les Schtroumpfs because they were created in Belgium. And the two creators of Les Schtroumpfs flew out to Hanna-Barbera and sat with all of us prospective writers for the show and told us and answered questions about what Smurfs were and so forth. And then you would come up with ideas, or sometimes they might give you an idea. They were called premises. You type up like a single page, a paragraph or two of the basic notion. And some of the cartoons were 8 minutes long, some were a half hour long, depending on the show. And they basically fell into two categories: sort of funny animal comedy kind of things like Smurfs or Biscuits or The Littles or those kind of shows, and sort of superhero science fiction fantasy kind of shows. And that would include He-Man and Black Star, and real Ghostbusters kind of was in both worlds a little bit, but all of us were able to write all of it. I mean, you would write funny animals one day, you'd be writing superheroes the next, and with Super Friends and all of those. So you would write these premises and you would run them by the story editor or producer of the show, and and they would hire you to then write them. So you would work up an outline that might be a few pages long. Then you would write the script. Now the scripts were very long because you were everything that the characters say and do would be described, including, and you would break it down shot by shot by shot. So a half-hour script would be 55 pages long, and you would say, for instance, you might say long two shot Tila and He-Man. Then you'd have like a line of dialogue, and then you would go to angle over to Skeletor or whatever, and so you'd be breaking down every single shot. So then the storyboard artist could storyboard it, and then they would animate it. And this is the very end of what was called ink and paint, where it was they would do 12 frames per second, and it would be they would draw it first. They would draw the animation on paper, and then they would lay that down on a pegboard and a registration board, and they would put piece of celluloid over it, and then trace in ink on the cell the pencil drawing, and then they would take the back of that cell and paint it. It was called ink and paint. And now, of course, it's all done by computers. But back in those days, you could actually own the cells. And if you go to science fiction conventions even today, you'll find these cells for sale for, anywhere from a few bucks to thousands, depending on what show or what movie it's from. But and so I was at the very tail end of that, where that was how animation was done. But everything that was said, everything that happened in a given show, that was the writer, and so we had a lot of power, and yeah, that's how it worked.
So essentially, the script was the blueprint that everything came from.
Yeah, yeah. And so any jokes, any action, anything, Michael and Reeves and I, my friend Michael Reeves and I think wrote all of the episodes, or almost all the episodes of a show called Black Star. That was sort of a precursor to He-Man that Filmation did. And so we did one show, we co-wrote one show called The Wind Whales of Ankar. And we actually did an audio commentary on that episode when they released Black Star on home video. And it's just sort of like, okay, we came up with the wind whales, and we came up with the storyline of who's hunting them down and why, and so forth, and you would service the characters. So you would know that in a given episode there might be, like, for instance, in Smurfs, you'd have Papa and Brainy and all these different Smurfette, and Gargamel, and you'd have all these different characters with all their different traits and their specific goals and interests. And so you'd have the character voices in your head, so you would know. You wouldn't give a Brainy line to Papa Smurf or vice versa, because they had a very specific role in the show, and personality and temperament and so forth. So you got to be very good at sort of in your head imitating the various characters on any given show, which then served me very well as I moved into live action, because writing Brainy Smurf was much the same as writing Captain Picard.
Right.
So yeah,
or Data or whoever. Yeah,
whatever. Yeah.
very good. So we're I'm trying to piece together exactly how a cartoon show gets made. So it starts with an idea. Obviously, gets pitched.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah, and then
for a lack of an idea.
Right.
But nowadays it's very different. The directors have a lot more power. The writers might just kind of suggest the shape of the show, and then the directors are much more sort of the creative force on the show. So it's different now. And so you have writer producers who are essentially showrunners, like my friend Chris Wyatt, who works on a lot of the Marvel cartoons, where it's somewhat different. But I haven't been writing animation in recent years,
Right.
So the differences, I'm not sure of. But back then, absolutely, the writer was vital, and so they might say to you, well, we want to do something with a dragon, but more often than not you just come up with a bunch of ideas, type them up on a page. So it might be, I remember that Paul Dini, we were all working on He-Man, and Paul Dini, as a joke, wrote a premise called The Day Nothing Happened, and it was kind of like He-Man wakes up, runs a few laps, goes to the steam room. It's like, it was great. And but that was typical. So we might come up with 5 or 10 ideas, individual premises, and that was the one big change was when I started, you would write these scripts on a typewriter, and then it changed to computers very early on, K-Pro 2s, and with these big 5-inch floppy disks. And so you would have to write very quickly, and you had these stupid dot matrix printers where you had to tear off the edges, and it was tedious beyond words. And but things sped up, so because they knew that typing took a long time and correcting took a long time, but that was much easier on a computer. So generally you'd write a script in about a week or less, and a rewrite maybe in a day or two, depending on the notes. Yeah.
And so the script is done, and then you move on to the next script, or how much time is there in between?
Well, frequently you'd be working on multiple projects at once, often for different companies, often for different networks. So I might be coming up with premises for Smurfs while writing a script for Super Friends the same week. You'd sort of stagger the work, which again proved very useful in my training, because I learned how to write very quickly, how to shift gears very quickly, and how to come up with a lot of different notions. Now I tended to try to come up with ideas that I'd never seen before. For instance, there was a show called Pole Position that Michael Reeves and I wrote all of them, and my idea was I would come up only with storylines I'd never seen before, every title would be a riff on a Hitchcock title. So I had like The Chicken Who Knew Too Much, things like that. And and then if I came up with something that didn't fit the episode I was writing, I would sort of hold that in abeyance till the next episode. Because since Michael and I knew we were writing all of them, you could do that. You could sort of inhabit the show. But I was never under contract, exclusive contract to any of the companies. So I was a freelancer, deliberately so, going from company to company. So I was writing for Hanna-Barbera and Deke and Marvel and Ruby Spears and Filmation, all of them. Uh, and so that was, and so you would be outlining one story in the morning, maybe writing 10 pages of a script in the afternoon, whatever worked. And the fastest I ever wrote was I wrote one 55-page script in a day for, I think it was Black Star, and that was before computers came in. So I would write longhand, and my wife would type the script. She was a faster typist.
Uh,
That was a lot of work. But everything I wrote, all the scripts I wrote got made. Nothing. There was no you didn't write spec animation scripts back then. You wrote scripts, and so that was how that worked. So
so there was a constant demand because every week they had to have a new episode, right?
well, it was a small group of writers. We all knew each other. I mean, it was me and Buzz Dixon and Michael Reeves and Paul Dini and etc. So there weren't many of us. Maybe we were all rep by the same agent, an agent named Candice Montero. And when we started, they didn't even represent animation writers. Michael Reeves was Candy's first client. I was her second, and then she cornered the market. So basically, when they had a show coming up, they would call us all in, her writers, and we would if they had a sample material, if they had like a reel or something, they'd show it to us. In fact, when I wrote Real Ghostbusters, um, the movie had not come out on home video yet, so they sent us a VHS tape of the movie because we knew that the episodes we wrote were going to be direct sequels to the movie, and so that helped us kind of get the characters in our head, get the tone of the show in our head.
Let's
And
talk a little bit more about the real Ghostbusters. I mean, I'm sure some people listening know the story, but for those who don't, why was it called the real Ghostbusters?
that was funny because Filmation previously had done a live action. This is before the Ghostbusters movie. They had done a live action kids show called Ghostbusters, and it starred Larry Storch and Forrest Tucker, who had been in F Troop, and I think it also had a gorilla, Kong the gorilla, something like that. And and it was, but it was about these Ghostbusters, but it had nothing to do with the movie. But they had the title, oddly enough, and so that's why Filmation called it the real Ghostbusters when they did the show, so that was how it worked. It may not have been Filmation that did the other one. It blurs after all this time, but there were two camps of story editors running Real Ghostbusters. One was Chuck Menville and Len Jansen, who were a writing team. I'd worked with them on Smurfs previously, and they wanted to do things that were kind of very cartoony and lowbrow, lots of slapstick. They were primarily doing kind of the Slimer cartoons.
I was just going to say Slimer. Yeah, he's the embodiment of that.
Yeah. Joe Straczynski, who at the time was a very good friend of mine, he was story editing, and he said to us, make it just like a sequel to the movie. Write it exactly as if you were writing an adult movie. And so that's what we did. And so I vastly preferred his approach. And so I think I wrote four of them: Station Identification, Look Homeward, Ray, two others, and it was a lot of fun. I was parodying, a lot of characters in media. And it was, but the other part about writing it, by the way, was that every now and then you might talk to one of the artists or suggest a design for one of the characters, but you weren't in on the recording sessions generally, and you weren't, unless you were in-house, you weren't part of the production pipeline, and so you wouldn't see it until it aired usually. And if then, there are probably cartoons I wrote that I've never even seen. I'm sure there are.
Oh yeah, and I think it goes down to uh, writing, because all these cartoons are for kids essentially, and it's
Yeah.
do you dumb it down for the kids, or do you give it to them straight? And
Oh, someone at the time once asked me, "Do you write for the child in the audience?" And I said, "No, I write for the child in myself." And so I never dumb down anything I write. Basically, I would write what entertained me. So if it was a joke that made me laugh, then I'd put it in. If it was a story I wanted to see, I'd put it in. It was like Centurions, all these different shows. I was entertaining myself. And if I couldn't find entertainment in it, then I wasn't doing my job, because it had to be entertaining to me. Otherwise, I had no compass to fly by, you know. And but I mean, you know, these were generally genuinely funny shows. And I remember there was one show I was writing with Michael Reeves, and it was for a show called, it was, I think it was the Biscuits. It was the Biscuits, which was little dog characters. It was almost like Smurfs if they were little dogs. And um and we had a line that we wanted between this dog and this boy dog, and it was a riff on Hitchcock. I mean, not Hitchcock, on Humphrey Bogart. So it was like, I've met a lot of dames in my life, but you're, and
Right.
we were trying to figure out the payoff line, and we were just busting our brains on that. And finally, we came up with, "But your pick of the litter." And like, we were so pleased.
And that works. Yeah.
It does, but we were just breaking our heads on that one. And but uh, but we knew. I mean, we were young and we were enthusiastic and we were um, ambitious. I mean, many of us went on to other accomplishments and greater heights in a way. But we never condescended. We always were doing our best job. We were it was like we would go to, parties together at each other's houses. It was a very convivial, collegiate atmosphere. It wasn't dog eat dog. It was, or knife in the back. It was very much, we all were working professionals. You could earn about 100 grand in 3 months, 4 months back then, which was, really good money back then, still is.
Yeah.
And it was, but also I mean, I was the god of animation. I didn't, it came to a point where I didn't even have to pitch anymore. They would just say, okay, here's a show, we'll give you, half of the show to write, or whatever. It was like, okay, they trusted me. And so there came a point where I didn't even have to come up, write the premises. I would just say, well, I have in mind to do something along these lines, and they'd say, go for it. And so that was great, and my price rate rose accordingly. And but we were all young and ambitious, and not, there was a great positive quality. We weren't beaten down. We weren't cynics in any way, shape, or form. We, all of us, were enjoying what we were doing. But many of us were also writing novels at the time, or books, or spec screenplays, or spec pilots. I mean, some of us loved animation. Like Paul Dini just loved animation, and this was like the perfect job for him. I never intended to be an animation writer. It's just that I knew I wanted to be a writer, producer in TV, and my friend Michael Reeves was writing for a show called Space Stars that had Space Ghost as the main character. And he was writing all of them, and he said, "Do you want to write a script with me?" And I said, "Sure," because it got me into television. And it turned out I collaborated on that script, and I collaborated on a Smurfs episode. And by then, it was very obvious I could write them on my own, and had the ability. And then I was off and running, but I learned my craft in animation. At the same time I was writing the Twilight Zone Companion, the book, to educate myself in how to make great TV. But my craft uh, was, I learned in animation. And at one point, and initially I struggled with structure, but at one point I was writing so quickly that it just became second nature, and it stayed that way ever since. I mean, when I'm structuring something, I just have this innate sense of it, and I'm grateful to animation for that.
Great. We're going to take a quick. Okay. So we've talked a lot about your work in animation, and a little bit how you got into animation. Let's go a little bit further back.
Sure.
How did you get started in writing in general? Did you go to college for that, or?
No, no, no. I'm uh, essentially, I was an avid reader from as far back as I can remember. I loved science fiction from the age of 4 or 5. The first favorite book I can remember was when I was 7. My favorite book was Farmer in the Sky by Robert Heinlein. It was one of the Heinlein juveniles. And I read, I watched TV. I loved movies. I read science fiction voraciously. I read comic books, and that was the age of great science fiction comic books. So I was reading, Superman and Mysteries in Space and on, Magnus Robot Hunter, you name it. And and I was drawing also. So I knew I'd either be an artist or a writer. And so I got into UCLA Art School, and as a painting, sculpture, and graphic arts major. So I was doing all that stuff and having gallery shows and so forth. And then at the same time, I wrote a satire, a radio play that was a satire of science fiction conventions and science fiction movies and TV shows. And that I wrote that when I was 18, and it aired on KPFK. And I wrote it and acted in it and directed it. And then um, when I was 19, I went to the Clarion Writers Workshop, which is the leading science fiction writing workshop, and I sold a short story to one of our teachers, an editor named Damon Knight, who wrote the story To Serve Man, and I sold my first short story, and then I knew I was going to be a writer. From then on, I knew. But because I'd started in the arts, the visual arts, I had a very strong visual sense, and again, that helped me enormously when I was writing animation, and then going into writing what I write now, live action science fiction. I'm dealing with a lot of visual artists, and but even when I was writing animation, I would see it in my head. I would see the shots in my head, and that never was a particular problem.
Because you had to be a little more descriptive in
Yeah,
animation than you do
yes,
in live action.
yeah, and I mean, but now that I'm a writer, producer, director, I have that same obligation to be specific visually, and so in other words, whether that comes in the writing phase or the design phase, or when we're shooting or doing visual effects, I mean, it all is the same challenge. And but the one bonus in terms of writing all this animation was that. Or an additional bonus was that for 20 years after I got out of animation into live action, which was my goal, I never mentioned that I wrote animation. And then one day I was at the Museum of Radio and Television, the Paley Center in Beverly Hills, watching some old TV thing that they had in their archive. And I heard the kids behind the counter raving about shows I'd written, like Smurfs. And so I went up and I said, I wrote for Smurfs. And their eyes got big and they were so impressed. And so then I started letting people know I'd written for all these shows, He-Man and so forth. And now one thing that was fun, I must say, was when I wrote for Super Friends. Since I'd grown up reading, Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman and Green Lantern, to be able to write those characters was really, really fun. And then I got to write the animated Incredible Hulk as well. So sometimes you'd be writing characters that you'd grown up with, and that was a kick, and. So it was, but it's very funny because we started writing for He-Man before they made the show, before they animated the show, and I always thought he was so odd looking with that little, page boy haircut. And I remember when they did the video, the DVD release, and they interviewed me about He-Man, and they said, "What do you think about the look of He-Man?" And I said, "Well, if you oiled him up, he'd fit into any gay bar in town." And so somehow that comment didn't make it into the final
No.
documentary. But I did do an episode commentary on one of my episodes, and that was really fun. So yeah, but I'm proud of the work I did in animation. I mean, the lesson I learned, and I learned this from my mentors, Harlan Ellis and many of these great writers from Star Trek and Twilight Zone, was you never write down, you never do anything other than your the best possible work you can do. My friend Frank Spotnitz, who ran the X Files and then created Man in the High Castle, he said you always aim for the fences because maybe then you'll get a single. It's like
Yeah.
you aim high. And then one time one of my fans called me and he said, "Well, I just watched your episode of whatever animated show," and he said, "That one wasn't as good as your usual work." And I said, "Well, you know how sometimes you're in school and you take a test and you do your damnedest, but you get a B or a C plus or whatever. It's kind of like that, that
Yeah.
week I'm like off my feed, whatever." But it was never
It
for
wasn't
lack
that.
of trying.
Yeah, it wasn't that you were trying to do bad.
No, not at all. Now, some shows would allow you more opportunity. Like, for instance, I enjoyed writing The Littles very much. That was a lot of fun, and that was sort of again like a knockoff Smurfs. These little creatures, and they had tails, and they were fun. But Smurfs or all of these shows, you'd find the opportunities, and you'd find the things that would make it meaningful to you as a writer, and you'd turn in these 55-page scripts for a half hour. I mean, that's the equivalent now of a 55-page script on a live action show. That's an hour show, and so we were really really working. And but I don't think any of us regret the work we did back then. Again, we loved it. It was fun, and I have no regrets about any of the shows I wrote for.
Great. So this section of the show, I like to ask our guests to give any advice for people potentially trying to get into the career that you're in. So, for potential writers in animation,
Yes,
let's
yes.
say,
Well,
what advice would you give?
Well, first of all, I just finished a new book that I'm writing called Greenlighting Yourself, and that's coming out from Silman James as soon as I send it to them, which gives a lot of information on how to start a career in the business as a writer, director, actor, producer. In terms of animation, learn first of all, learn from people who do the work. Learn from the people whose work you love. So if you're watching an animated show, most of these people are on social media in one way or another. Reach out to them and say, listen, could I just have a Zoom call with you to ask a bunch of questions? I love your work. Most of them will say yes. Animation writers are not the giant egos that you might get in features or in big TV shows. It's a different vibe, and they're friendly. And then just moving to LA would help, because that's where the work is. Meet people in person if you can once the pandemic's over. It's I mean, just basically learn your craft, meet people. uh you'd probably want to write spec scripts of some of your favorite animated shows. But just be dogged. I was very lucky that I happened to meet someone who brought me into television. But but as I said, my goal wasn't to write, animation, was to write like Star Trek, and, but I saw my opportunity. I saw this move me forward toward where I wanted to go. And so as a result, I didn't turn it down. If when Michael said, would you like to write this animated show, I could have said, no, no, I want to write for Star Trek, and that would have closed a door that opened for me. So yeah, sorry about that.
No worries.
Hold on, I'll just turn this off.
We'll
Sorry.
edit that out
Yeah, we
of the
will.
pod of the.
And let me go back to my Zoom icon and find out what I'm doing here, because I can't see you. Uh-oh. Decline. And let's see where I just have to find you where you are.
Yep.
Where's the screen? I'm sure it's here somewhere. Video details, post attendee. Okay. Let's see. I don't see you, but I will.
I can see you, and
Okay, good. Well, I'll just
we're
keep
good.
talking, and we'll just
You're
assume
we're fine.
that. Oh, there. I think I found the right icon. There you are. I
Hey,
got it.
there we are. Okay.
Yeah. Good. Okay, great. Keep going.
So, so let's
But yeah. So advice for a beginner.
yes, advice.
I,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, again, write what you love. Write what you love. Don't if there's an animated show that doesn't work for you, you don't get it, it doesn't resonate. You're not going to do a good script of it. It'll be crap, no matter how much you analyze the show. Find the things that you absolutely adore, that is like your dream come true. Write that, and or create your own show. I mean, now with the internet and so forth, you can actually, and with video, and programs where you can animate, you can actually animate your own show and do the voices, or find friends who can do the voices, like Adam Sartain does voices.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I mean, you have the choice of either looking for someone to hire you, or creating the work that you want to create and putting it out into the world. Now I would suggest the latter, because then you're actually doing the work and proving what you can do, and also gaining an audience. And the moment they see that you're doing something entertaining and peculiar and interesting, the one thing that is different in animation now from when I started is the parameters of animation are much broader. The stylistic parameters, the content parameters. There's adult animation and kids animation. I mean, our shows, even though they were written for ostensibly for a kid audience, there were a lot of adults watching those shows too, because they were fun. But now, obviously, you have all sorts of shows that are intended for adults only, and that's fine. But again, just find your tribe. I often say, find the people who are going to be on your wavelength, and then bang a gong so they hear you, they become aware of you, they see what you're doing. The great thing about animation, particularly if it's funny, is you can tell if something works or it doesn't work, because if people laugh, then it's working, and if they don't
Exactly.
laugh, it's not. But just go for it. I mean, don't be afraid. Don't worry that you're going to fail. Just total full commitment. Totally throw yourself into it, and generally, it'll work, because love and creativity and imagination and your true heart of who you are, authenticity, all of that, it comes through. And there's so many weirdos out there. Somebody's going to get it. you know. So,
Yes. Very good. Wonderful advice. So we're running out of times, but before we go, I want to give you a chance to um, tell our audience what you're working on now. What are the plans for the future?
well, they're big. I thanks to my audience, I was able to raise the money to start shooting Space Command, which is a big science fiction show. I've got my own YouTube channel where you can check it out, Mr. Sci-Fi on YouTube. And I also post about science fiction in every permutation. And we're creating the Showrunners Network, which is 6 shows that I'm creating with the guys who created Farscape and The Expanse and many other great science fiction shows. And then I'm also writing books, so like Greenlighting Yourself. And I basically wake up every day and do things that are just thrilling to me, that I love doing. And so I'm living the dream. I was very lucky to find my calling early. I knew I'd be a writer or an artist, and now I'm actually both in my way. And it's I'm very, very lucky, and so I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to create work. I mean, when you're talking about all my animated work, you're talking about 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so to write something that's lasted all these decades and that people still remember and still love is a great honor and a great privilege. And so I didn't know that that would happen at all. It easily could have been, something I wrote that no one remembers. Yeah, I wrote for Smurfs. So yeah, well, what's that? God knows. But you don't have to say that. And so I'm really, really lucky and really blessed and really grateful. So
Great.
every day's Christmas for me.
Great. And of course, go ahead and shout out your social media
Yes.
handles so
Yeah.
people can follow you. And
Sure.
if you
At Mark Zickery is one of them. I'm also on Facebook. There's also Space Command, links and so forth. You can go to Space Command. Is it spacecommandseries.com, Adam? It's something. There's a
Space
website.
Command dash the
Yeah,
series.com is the official.
spacecommand-series.com. But Mr. Sci-Fi is basically the beginner drug. I mean, it'll lead you
Yes,
everywhere.
on
And
YouTube. Yes.
yeah, gateway. And yeah, and then I'm just very accessible, markzickery@gmail.com. And life is good, and I'm thrilled to be working with all my heroes. And it's really fun. Watch this space. There's a lot more coming.
Yeah, and it's been an absolute honor and a privilege to have you, one of my here, the architect of my childhood,
Yes,
or one
yes,
of the
yes,
architects of my
yes.
childhood, as it were.
Yes.
So
It's really fun. It's really great. And some of the people I worked with back then were my heroes from my childhood. Like, the voice of Gargamel, that was Paul Winchell, who had been a ventriloquist and had a TV show when I was a kid. And so to write for actors that I grew up loving on kid shows that I loved, that was, there's continuity to all of this. It's like very much a sense of paying it forward. So I'm thrilled to
great.
be part of that.
Awesome. So thank you again for being on the show. And thank you all out there listening and watching on YouTube. Again, I'm Adam Sartain, and this has been Inside Animation.